Um, Alison Hume, let me ask you. I know that you're a new Labour MP, but clearly there are people who are worried about the scale of immigration, and we only have to look at some of the remarks that we're seeing coming in. Not necessarily people who are in any way condoning the violence, but do you think it is enough just to condemn the far right thuggery as the Prime Minister has done? Or do you think that Labour needs to look a bit more widely at the scale of the concerns that there are in many of these communities that are now being affected by the Trouble, um, about the scale of immigration into the country?
Absolutely. Here in Scarborough and Whitby, one of the main issues on the doorstep during the election campaign were worries about immigration. Fortunately, we're not seeing anything like we're seeing across the country in Scarborough and Whitby. But people were saying to me, this isn't right. And of course, we fought the campaign saying we will make changes to the immigration problem. We will set up a border security command to smash the gangs. And of course, in our first days in office, we canned the Rwanda gimmick. And as it turned out, they'd spent far more than the 500 million that we knew about. So we know it's a problem, and we have got our plans to do something about it. But let's be very clear. Talking about the immigration problem is completely separate from the riots that we're seeing across our towns and cities now. Attacking emergency services, buildings, making people fearful to leave their homes, fearful for having the wrong colour skin, is completely separate from having a debate about immigration and talking about how we're going to sort it out. The two can't be conflated as they have been, and that's where the danger is. This is why the far right have been able to inflame the situation, is because the two issues are being mixed up. Of course, we need to talk about the problem, but this isn't the way to solve it.
But Mark, the problem is that the two are being conflated, aren't they? They are being conflated by some on the right. They are being conflated online.
I mean, what I'm finding is just sort of wandering around over the weekend, and this is not necessarily seeking out people, but if I go shopping in, well-known supermarket or something, people will come up to me and say two things. One of which is they abhor what's been going on in these riots, and they are absolutely appalled by it. But there's a but, and the but is that the people are worried about the idea of immigration, and it's quite interesting when you talk to people about it because we talk about the need, for example, for the social care sector or for nurses, and people sort of say, yeah, that's absolutely fine, but it's everything else, and actually when you start talking to people about it, they're not that clear on what the issues are necessarily. People are certainly angry about the illegal migrants coming over in the boats, and they see that as being very unfair. And at the most basic level, you can talk to somebody who maybe saves up, for 50 weeks in the year to go on a 2-week holiday to Butlins in Scunthorpe or somewhere, and they suddenly see that somebody comes over illegally and gets 52 weeks a year staying there at the taxpayer's expense, and it's just fundamentally sort of great. But I think we do have to have a solution to this.
Do you think
The
the
Rwanda.
present government was right to drop the Rwanda scheme?
No, not at all. I'm uncomfortable with the Rwanda scheme. I didn't like the sort of the principle of it, but in the absence of any better idea, a deterrent is something which is certainly worth having. And at the end of the day, if the Rwanda scheme works 100% perfectly, not a single person will be sent to Rwanda. It'll deter people from coming over, and then it would have been successful. And that's where we would have saved the costs of it, because of there'll be the reduced costs in the hotels. Now that that's been cancelled, there's no deterrent. And actually, this idea of the new border force, border security command, or whatever it's called, is we've already had that. We've already been working to try to bust the criminal gangs and all of the rest of them. So this is not anything that's actually new. It's just the same thing that's been rebranded. But look, I mean, at the end of the day, this is not a UK problem. This is a global problem. And if you look at America, I think on one day recently, 10,000 migrants crossed the Mexican border. If you go and talk to the Greeks or the Italians or the Spanish, they're all looking at what we were trying to do in the UK with the Rwanda scheme in order to see if it would potentially work for them.
Well, of
So
course, the Rwanda scheme, no one actually left under the Rwanda scheme, so we'll never know now whether it would have acted as a deterrent. Max, what do you make, though, of the way that this has pushed up the agenda? People saying, look, there is a wider issue here about the scale of immigration into this country. And as one of our listeners pointed out, local communities concerned at groups of asylum seekers being housed in local hotels, which have been targeted in many of these protests that we're seeing unfolding in our towns and cities this afternoon.
Perfectly reasonable to have a discussion about immigration. It's perfectly reasonable to have a discussion about refugees and asylum seekers. I don't really recognise what Mark was saying there about the Rwanda scheme. It proved to be a massive waste of money, and even when it was to all intents and purposes up and running and people knew about it, it wasn't proving to be much of a deterrent. And if you want to get rid of the small boats, the way to do it is to have safe and legal routes for refugees and asylum seekers. That's the only way we're going to stop the gangs. We can talk as tough as we like, but sometimes it's just being pragmatic. And Mark, if he was in a different frame of mind, perhaps he might be talking about the success of the previous government's arrangements with Albania, for example, which was probably a good example of where they could point to where something was done. In general, though, we do need to think about what kind of balance we have in this country around immigration and asylum seekers and refugees. And of course, asylum seekers and refugees are fleeing persecution, and they have international rights under the international legal system. When we're talking about immigration, though, and Alison and Mark have both pointed it out, I think, when we're talking about people who are going to work in our social care system, when we're talking about people who are going to work in our local hospitals, when we're talking about people who are going to take other jobs in public services in the local area, we need to have a much more grown-up debate about this, because as Mark pointed out, when you talk to people, they might have a very valid concern about the general level of immigration into this country. However, most people do recognise that when migrants come to this country and they work, they make a contribution to our society. And one of the things that we should be doing is much more taking a much rounder view about this. It is, of course, entirely reasonable to have a debate about immigration. No one is suggesting that we shouldn't have that. However, we do need to look at it in the round and make sure that we're not shooting ourselves in the foot when it comes to the debate, because we will end up having public services that are worse off, an economy that is harmed, and plenty of other stuff too. So I just think we do need to take some of the sting out of this discussion, particularly when we're talking about it in the light of the violence and the riots that we've seen over the last few days, because there is a real risk that if we're talking about immigration into this country, just in the context of riots and violence, we will never get to the right solution.